Hey guys, this is Mr. Cruz. I wanted to make another video that I told you I'd make for Chapter 3 of The Great Gatsby. Hopefully this video is a little bit better in terms of audio. Last time, I think I just maybe spoke a little too low, and maybe that contributed to the audio issues. And then I was also wearing the headphones, which may have also contributed to it. I'm not sure, but hopefully it's working now and a little bit easier to understand me. This video is not going to be too long, and it's only one chapter, so it's chapter 3. And then the other thing is that there's not going to be questions attached to this. Obviously this is something I could use for a quiz or test, so it might be good to watch, but there's not going to be questions or a formal assessment. This is just a kind of informal discussion for us, as if we were in class, as if we were talking about it. But some things that I think that are important to pay attention to and to think about while you're reading. Some themes that are definitely going to be showing up for the rest of the novel. So in this chapter, you know that Nick Carraway meets Jay Gatsby, who is the next door neighbor, the mysterious next door neighbor, the one who Carraway continues to receive, mysterious invitations from, who sees sort of, there's a kind of mystique around him, this guy, Gatsby. And that continues even when they meet each other. There's a kind of open-guardedness, and that seems like it's contradictory, but it's very much a kind of paradox in the novel. So open in the sense that he welcomes him. He calls him old sport instead of Mr. Carraway or something very formal. Old sport also, they were both in the military, so it's like there's a kind of, I'm sure you know of people who, especially those military members who have been in battle together, it's like there's a kind of camaraderie that exists that you can't find really anywhere else. And so there's an openness there. Gatsby says, you can help yourself to anything in my house, despite the fact that this is their first time meeting. And of course, it's at a party held at Gatsby's house, or a gathering of sorts. There's interesting things that I think are really important to pay attention to. Like, for example, the people there, when they gather near these books or like bookshelves, and they touch the books and they see that the books are real. They grab the books and they open them. There's pages and there's words. And they Miss Baker specifically says, the books, they're real, and is surprised by this fact. And it's a small thing, a small detail, but one of the things that you have to pay attention to is the way in which this society uses things like books, or even fake books, for example, to be able to prop up their status in society, to be considered educated or to be considered elite. Miss Baker recognizes something that Nick hasn't quite recognized, which is that part of being in this society is giving up a little bit like how one portrays oneself in like Instagram, for instance, or how one portrays themselves on social media, right? You give a taste of what you want people to see as opposed to what actually is. So the fact that the books themselves are real gives people a kind of shock, right? Because it implies that Gatsby has actually read them, right? Another thing to consider is some of the partygoers. And the reason why I say this is because I think it's connected to the novel, is the 1920s, I told you, remember, was a time of what's called Prohibition, which means that there was no, it was illegal to purchase and sell alcohol, right? So once there's a lot of rumors flying around about how Gatsby gets his money. Is he a bootlegger? Of course, which was a very illegal activity, very much connected to mafia activity in terms of how the Prohibition worked. So Italian and Irish and Jewish mafia were like very concerned with this sense of Prohibition in the 1920s. Because remember, in history, they came around in the 1880s and 1890s. So this huge wave, there's like 13 million immigrants that had come from Europe. And by the time the 1920s have settled in, they've created this organized ways of living in the Northeast, particularly in places like New York, because New York has a long history of like immigrants that would come into New York Harbor, places like Boston, those sorts of things. So look at all the alcohol that's being consumed in Gatsby's place. Some people say things like, "I've been drunk for a week now," right? This kind of like licentiousness, and I brought this word up from in the previous novel, this licentiousness, the things that the Puritans wanted to get away from, which is interesting. From a literary standpoint, we move from the Scarlet Letter, where the Puritans wanted to get away from the licentiousness they found in England, and they kind of moved to America as a way of protesting that licentiousness, but then moving towards like the correct way of worshiping God. Look at how far we've come by the 1920s. Look at where we are in the 1920s. Somebody saying, "I've been drunk for a week now." A week. Think about that for a second. I haven't come up for air for a week. I've just been continuing and continuing and continuing. By the time that we meet Gatsby, there's this really interesting way that the author Fitzgerald puts it. That Gatsby, this is Nick Carraway's thinking of this, that Gatsby smiles with the quality of eternal reassurance, with the sense in which he identifies with you and makes you feel as though you're the only person in the room, or at least from Nick Carraway's perspective. Remember, we're in his head. So Gatsby, smiles with the sense of reassurance, the sense of keeping you, being the only person in the room. And yet, of course, every time Nick gets close to meet Gatsby, or every time Nick gets close to talk to Gatsby, something pulls him away. Hey, Boston's on the phone with you. They need to talk to you. Hey, Philadelphia's on the phone with you. They need to talk to you. Of course, we have zero clue what that means, right? That could be anything. And again, think about like all the swirls of rumors going around about Gatsby throughout the party. Hey, I heard he was a bootlegger. Oh, I heard he was a murderer. I heard he was doing, X, Y, and Z activity, right? That was somehow illegal, right? That's how he got his money. And nobody has any concern about this, by the way. It's not like everybody's like, "Oh, this is dreadful. Like this is terrible that he would make his money this way, in this illegal way." Everybody's pretty much like, "Oh, perfect. Illegal activity? You're doing great. Made money. That's what matters," right? And yet, given the swirl of activity that's going on, the partying, the drinking, the anything else that's going on, that's probably can't be spoken of in these, in this situation, there maintains a sense of boredom between all the people that are at that party. There's a sense of boredom in their own lives, and a sense of boredom even there at the party. They're looking for ways to draw them outside of that boredom, to give them a sense of, at least for a second, a sense of pleasure. And I'm not using pleasure in any kind of derogatory fashion. I'm using pleasure in the sense of like, even the pleasure of like drinking water when you're thirsty after a run, for instance, like, this like sense of like a quench thirst, right? Something that they're looking for. That the minute that they find something that could at least quench their thirst for a second, they're looking for the new thing, the next thing, right? Because you're not satisfied with what you have. You need the next thing, and then the next thing, and then the next thing, and then the next thing. There's a really great show, I think, that encapsulates this really well. It's not in the 1920s, but it's in the 1960s, which is called Mad Men. You might have heard of it. It's a pretty recent show. Main character's name is Don Draper. He's in advertising, an ad man, and that they were on Madison Avenue, which is why they're called Mad Men. That's in New York City, and and he has a great line in one of the episodes that says, "What's happiness?" Right? Happiness is the feeling that you get right before the search for the next piece of happiness, right? In the sense that your desires are never met fully. You're never satisfied because you need the next thing. If you have 50% of a business, you can't just rest satisfied with 50% of a business. You need 100%. You need all of it, right? And of course, once you have gotten all of it, right, all of another business, you need another business to conquer, right? Because you're not satisfied with that. And there's very much a sense in which, for the rich in West Egg and East Egg, that there's a sense in which that's occurring, right? They need more and more and more and more. They're never satisfied with what they have. Look at Nick Carraway as an outsider of this sort of function of this party. He's not a person who's rich in the kind of ways that these people would, think about his visit to Tom Buchanan. Like, Tom Buchanan can buy whatever he wants. Nick Carraway can't do that, and he very much recognizes that right from the beginning of the novel. But I told you guys that Nick Carraway still has means. It's not like this is a guy who has nothing. This is a guy whose father could pay for him to live in New York City in Long Island for a year. That guy had, he comes from some money, right? It's not quite, what's this John Steinbeck book? Grapes of Wrath. It's not quite that. That's a totally different sense of poverty. But Nick Carraway is an outsider. But you start to begin to notice ways already in which Nick Carraway is becoming more like the society that he is close to. And this isn't like a novel point. It's not something that we, I'm not bringing this really, really incredible point to bear to you guys because it's such a new point. I think we all know we kind of become our surroundings, right? There's this really famous quote that says, "Show me your friends and I'll show you who you are." I always kind of struggle with that quote because Jesus was a friend of sinners, and I'm not so sure it's always true. But in this case, Nick Carraway is certainly becoming the people he's surrounded by, and he's becoming them because of his overwhelming curiosity. You see this with his relationship with Miss Baker. He says, "I'm not in love. I wasn't in love with her, right? There wasn't a sense of like real care. Like, he cared about her, like, I guess if she lived or died or, if something bad happened to her and stuff, but it wasn't a sense of love. He's not in love with her. He's just curious. That's what he says. I'm just curious. So I continue to spend time with her." Which is, I think, describing the society that he's becoming a part of, which is this sort of curiosity that he continues to abide by. The curiosity of, again, the lure of alcohol, for example. Even though it's illegal, it's the lure of that altered state, the sense in which that could change who you are. Perhaps it could change the way you are in front of other people, or perhaps it could change the way you are in front of that person that you want to get closer to, right? That curiosity will lead you down paths that you never intended to go to, but you do go to, right? Especially in more, again, altered states. But here's where I think the negative, and we'll end off here. Here's where the negativity begins to arise also. When they leave the party, Nick Carraway gets into the car with Miss Baker, and he recognizes something about her and about that society already, that she's a bad driver. She's a terrible driver. And she's driving on the road. She's driving like, it's one of these people that, switching lanes too much, who are going too fast, who are driving on the wrong side of the road because they want to pass another person. It's like, what are you doing? Is what Nick says. Like, are you crazy or something? Like, you're going to get us killed. And she says something so profound that I'm going to quote it for you. She says, "They'll keep out of my way," right? They'll keep out of my way, not a mutual desire to keep out of each other's way. They'll keep out of my way, right? And why? It's because they'll be the ones to look out for traffic violations. Like if I move into the wrong lane, they'll move into the next lane and they'll avoid me, right? But here's the thing. Miss Baker says, I hate careless people too. Ugh, I can't stand when people are careless. So, they'll keep out of my way. And then Nick says, well, yeah, but, isn't that a little careless? And she's like, oh, I hope not. I hate careless people. But she gets to be careless, right? And of course, that's a commentary a little bit about what Fitzgerald is writing about in terms of the society. It's that the rich get to be careless. They are allowed to be, right? And again, I'm thinking of this like very ultra rich, like Long Island. Remember I told you about the $80 that Nick Carraway spends for this modest house? $80 back then could have been what we in South Florida would be like paying for $6,500 house. I mean, this is a humongous house or an amazing piece of property in South Florida for $80. That's Nick Carraway, who's the least of the rich in Long Island. So you can imagine what a guy like Gatsby is paying for, $15,000-$20,000 a month in terms of the house that he's living in. So the rich do get to be careless, but despise those who are just like them. And I think that's the message that they leave us on in chapter 3. And it's not just true of the driving. Look at what's happening in the party, right? I've been drunk a week now. It makes so much more sense now. You get to be careless for a week. Who among us can stop for a full week and just do whatever we want and not be a part of society? Like the people who live on Long Island, they get to be that way, particularly in West Egg. And remember what I told you, West Egg versus East Egg. East Egg is old money, right? It's different. West Egg is new money, and new money gets to flaunt themselves. New money gets to, be in any kind of real. They get to flaunt themselves in a way that that they don't have to be a part of everyday society. They don't have to work necessarily. Or maybe their money is already making money on their behalf, and so they don't have to go to report to a job. It's not the same. And that sense of carelessness has become, it will eventually become even more on display. The last thing I wanted to focus on is there's a symbol that I forgot to talk about in the last video. And it's the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. Every time they drive into West Egg, you see these eyes, these spectacles. And there is a symbol, I think, there that is a kind of godlike figure is staring down at this this careless kind of wasteland, this place in which nobody's really attending to morality or a sense of care for other people. This place, whatever it is a place of real judgment in the novel. And I think that that's one of the things in American society that we still are reckoning with, where, at what point is our somewhat worship of celebrities, celebrity culture, of people's desire to make money. Has money replaced God? In many ways, it has, and I think there's a reason why Jesus in the New Testament says you can't serve God and money. You just can't. So we'll leave it there, and thanks for listening, guys.